Russians of Reddit, what is the older generation's opinion on the USSR? Both my parents were born and raised in Kazakhstan. My dad's side fled to Germany sometime before the collapse, but my mom's side only had the opportunity during the collapse. She only recently told me that when everything started going to, and all of the smaller countries decided they wanted to become independent states, the Russian government basically dropped the shared currency and introduced their new currency from basically one day to the next. When this happened, they had already booked their flights from their town to Moscow, and then from Moscow to Germany, with a day layover. They were very much aware that they didn't have any money to spend in Moscow, but luckily the hotel was paid for by the German government. However, this still left them with the transport from the airport to the hotel. She told me that when they got there, none of the taxis would accept the old currency, even though people who were natives there could have taken the money and exchanged it for new currency without much hassle. They finally found a taxi driver who took them to the hotel and accepted their money, but she also said that he was very tense the whole time, because apparently most airport taxis back then were controlled by the mob. Mom told me that before the collapse the USSR wasn't so bad, if you played your part. Dad's side of the family are, for the most part, still very nostalgic about the good old times when everyone had a stable job and a simpler life. But I also have to mention that my mom lived in a bigger city in the north close to the Russian border, and had thus access to more amenities and, more importantly, information, while my dad grew up on a farm in a small village in the far south, and his family were largely self-sustaining. Edit. Sorry I spelled Kazakhstan wrong. I grew up speaking German, and we write it Kazakhstan. Also it was 12:30, and I was really tired. Edit 2. I only saw this now. Thank you for my very first award. Kind stranger, smiley face. My mother and I came here from a former Soviet Union state when I was 3. During her prime, she was a high-ranking medical officer, then afterwards she continued to be an OBGYN. She's in her late 60s now, but whenever I ask her how did our family live, and what it was like, she always described it positively. For a family of doctors, mother, father, and grandmother were all doctors. We lived in modest high-rise apartment, 3 bedrooms, living room, couple bathrooms, kitchen, along with other tenants who had a wide range of occupations. Everyone in my town went to the same bazaar. We used to play soccer in the parking lot of the apartment building. My grandmother used to tell us stories of how hard it was in the beginning of the Soviet Union, and through WW2. When she was around the age of 10 she was forced to work on a cotton farm, and till the day she passed she would always avoid them. But she was very fond of Stalin and genuinely supported him, because of how peaceful things became after WW2. My mother acknowledges the negative things that he did, but she doesn't disagree of how good of a life she had. Up until the Soviet Union collapses, and the states were overrun by corrupt autocrats, there weren't so many complications and difficulties as there are when we moved here. Day-to-day life wasn't as gloomy and shady as everyone likes to describe it in the West. I've lived in the US for most of my life. Life here is good, don't get me wrong, but if I can speak for the older generation of my family, I believe they loved the simplicity, camaraderie, and how much people cared for each other rather than compare themselves to others. My family and I are from Odessa. My parents were born in the early 1960s. Generally speaking, they were what you'd call progressives today on most social issues, and they were both academics. In general, they were quite happy living under the USSR. They had free education and free lodging. They grew up under a less restrictive Iron Curtain than their parents did, and they lived in a port city, so it was easy to smuggle in things like fashion magazines, music, etc. The big things they hated were the food shortages in the 80s, the constant political education, and the big one, antisemitism. My mom and her side of the family had a very different experience than my dad. For background, my mom's side is Russian, my dad's side is Jewish. My mother's family were true, good communists who were proud to serve their country, and proud of their ideals. My grandfather was some kind of special forces military, and he was very, very proud of his country. My father's family were less enthused about patriotism, and more concerned with surviving and remembering. That even though our home city had been occupied by Nazis, the Soviets had killed many of our family as well. When my dad went to apply for a graduate program in physics in Moscow, there was an oral examination to get in. You answered questions essentially until you were wrong. Most people were kept for an hour or two. What they'd do apparently to the Jewish students was they'd keep them for hours and hours longer, until they finally made a mistake. They kept my dad for about 8 hours, and then told him he couldn't attend. He went to study in Siberia instead, which was very far from home and from my mother, and he was the target of anti-Semitic violence by the police there more than once. When she went to live with him, it was much harder to live in a small rural Siberian town than it was back home, and they really struggled. Still, my dad really loved the USSR. He loved his life doing research, and never worrying too much about funding or tuition, the way I do now as a PhD student. He loved meeting students from all around the USSR and countries like Cuba. He was a ham radio operator and chatted with people all over the continent. Neither he nor my mom really wanted or needed a big house or fancy stuff. They were happy with their apartment. And though life was hard sometimes and they had to grow their own food or forage, to them it was just what you did. It wasn't fun or easy, but they don't talk about it as if they're angry about it. They did, however, absolutely hate the constant political education and having to recite whatever Brezhnev or whoever else said at whatever random day in history. We immigrated in 1996, 24 years ago, on the day actually, after the inflation and general situation in Ukraine had become untenable. My parents don't like Putin and don't like strong men in politics in general, but they generally are wary about talking politics at all. They miss a lot of the life they had in the Soviet Union. They miss the music. My dad was really into the underground scene and the art, the culture, the general values. They know that life wasn't great, and they weren't well off by any means, but until the inflation got really bad they were pretty happy. And they think that things got much worse after the fall. My mom even misses the kolkhoz. She picked fruit all summer in southern Ukraine, although my dad, who made bricks in Kazakhstan, is understandably a lot more ambivalent. The big thing that I'm sad about is that we lost all our Jewish religious observances because of the USSR. But on the other hand, my parents were absolutely shocked when I told them how much debt I needed to take on for university, or when we moved to Canada and saw so many homeless people on the street in the winter. My parents live pretty comfortably now. My dad works as a software developer, my mom is retired, but when we moved, we had no money at all, and suddenly things actually became harder. Like, there was so much stuff to eat, but my parents had no money, and weren't allowed by building regulations to grow stuff or have a garden. Rent wasn't controlled, and my dad's PhD was suddenly absolutely worthless. My mom says being poor back home was bad, but at least she knew how things worked, how to deal with it, and knew that people cared about her. When we immigrated, she felt that the country barely gave about us at all. And my dad acknowledges that what the universities did was horrible, but as he points out, it doesn't seem like they let in too many different kinds of people into higher education here either. Edit. Wow, thank you so much for the Reddit gold.